Hello, YouTube subscribers. How are you doing? I wanted to discuss something that was a little out of the ordinary for me. I usually discuss social and political issues 99% of the time, but this time I'm gonna switch it up a little bit. And this may have to do with pop culture a little bit or entertainment, but it's gonna be closer to reality, and please hear me out once more. This is actually about comic books, and the reason why I wanted to discuss comic books is simply because of the fact that most people don't seem to be aware of the fact that what inspired comic books is real life history, real life issues, starting with examples like the War Journal, which featured the very first superhero of Marvel Comics known as Captain America. Now, the World War II years was a time when American spirits have dropped so much, and there was a sense of despair because it was a very tense and emotional time for Americans and many other people around the world, particularly in the West. And while the Great War waged on between many other countries in Europe and even some countries from Asia were involved in World War II. And I say involved because China was struck by Japan and so on and so forth. There was something that instilled hope, and that was the War Journal comics with Captain America and his sidekick, good old Bucky. And of course, that really brought a sense of hope in many Americans when it was a tough time for every single one of them at the time. And it was actually a reflection of patriotic pride and never give up and turn your back on your beliefs as an American and turn your back on your pride as an American patriot. And that's what Captain America symbolized, and that was the inspiration of it all. Of course, this was drawn and created by 16-year-old Stan Lee at the time. And there are so many examples too. You also have Superman, which was actually a reflection of how immigrants were seen and were looked at and were treated when they came to the United States. Superman was a person who came from a different planet, and he was seen and looked upon as someone who was unique, but at the same time, someone who was awfully strange. And it was actually created. The idea of Superman was created by Jewish people, believe it or not, from what I heard, because they wanted to show the whole world what it was like for them to come immigrate to the United States as immigrants. And it was definitely, and someone who came from humble beginnings, uh, left his home behind, and he has made something great out of himself, and he eventually became a symbol of hope, and that is Superman. And of course, this is why he has become an inspiring figure for so many people of the youth. Much of the youth and many adults looked up to him as an inspiring figure of hope. And of course, this also brings me to one of my favorite examples, which was XMen. And of course, that was created by Stan Lee, the guy who created Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. And X-Men was in itself a reflection and a reference of racism and how blacks were treated in the 1960s in the United States and even before the 1960s. How they were oppressed and ostracized mainly by the rest of society because of the color of their skin. Of course, X-Men was different because they may have been human beings who even shared the same skin complexions as everyone else in the story, but they were ostracized, and there were mobs that always threatened them and attacked them because they had supernatural powers that they were born with. So this was pretty much giving viewers an idea of what racism was like and how people felt. And with the main characters who were discriminated against, it gave the viewers an idea of what impact racism had, and that was supposed to be the idea. Of course, the two main figures of the X-Men were Professor Charles Xavier, who had the power of telepathy and reading minds. He was a reflection of Martin Luther King, while Magneto, on the other hand, who was the main antagonist, who was actually nothing more than a misunderstood character, who was not only a proud mutant, but he wanted to unite his mutant brethren in a cause for a power and independence. And Magneto, of course, was the main antagonist, who himself was a reflection of Malcolm X. And it's funny because most people didn't really catch on to it until they learned about it as kids, about who Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were. And this is why it was easier to resonate with Magneto, because he actually encouraged his fellow mutants to fight back and to defend yourself if anyone dares to touch you or hurt you. While Professor X, of course, believed in the idea of turning the other cheek and using his voice, and he had a somewhat of a more diplomatic approach. But when the mutants were actually being hurt and attacked by a mob of human beings who didn't have powers because they were scared and weren't educated enough to learn about the mutants in the story, he always encouraged the mutants, do not fight back with self-defense. Do not physically defend yourself because you're making our fellow mutants look bad, is what he was implying. But of course, later on in the 70s, the story of the X-Men and the mutant brotherhood that Magneto had formed somewhat started to resemble the Black Panther Party, even though he was actually inspired by the great Malcolm X himself. And on one hand, it was unfair to portray him as the antagonist, knowing full well that he was actually the good guy. And this is why people who were fans of the X-Men resonated more with Magneto versus Professor Charles Xavier. And with that being said, this is why I always tell people, you can learn a lot from reading comics, not just because of the vocabulary. It's actually good for enhancing your vocabulary. However, when it comes to comic books, it was actually, most of them were inspired by racial injustice, prejudice, discrimination, and it was a huge reflection of that, by the way. And whenever you saw the citizens turn against the hero, that's because a lot of them were misunderstood. And whenever there's a famous political figure or a famous figure on TV, you'll always have two sides of the country either supporting or hating the person. And even stories like The Punisher brought a good example of how, and it sent a message of how corrupt and how flawed the justice system really was, and what ramifications occur when you take matters into your own hands when it comes to taking justice into your own hands instead of letting law enforcement deal with it. And this is why I also felt that The Punisher set another good example for people who believed in social and political issues. And of course, in the 1960s, let's not forget, Black Panther was also created as an African superhero who himself was actually designed as a means of giving black people a voice when many black people actually didn't have a voice. This was even before the Nation of Islam and the Civil Rights Movement, as well as the other gangs who actually were formed to protect themselves in the 60s, such as the Bloods and the Crips, and as well as before the 70s with the Black Panther Party. So with that being said, comic books don't just teach you about vocabulary, but they are a reflection of social and political issues, and how this could be thought-provoking if you looked at it from that point of view. And I do remember they showed a lot of that in the 1995 animated series of the X-Men. And shortly after the 9/11 attacks, I watched those same classic reruns on TV. And of course, as a Muslim myself, the early 2000s was an exceptionally tough time for Muslims, and this is where I started to resonate with the X-Men. And I don't open up about myself very much in my YouTube videos, but this is one of the few things I'd like to share because it was mainly created as a way of showing how racial injustice was harsh towards those who were oppressed, mainly being black people, because X-Men was a comic book created in 1962 or 63, I believe. So, with that being said, this is why I always firmly believe that you can learn a lot from comics. And this is why the best comic book companies, in my opinion, to me, have always been Marvel and DC Comics, because they reflected political and social issues that involved racial injustice, prejudice, and even sexism at that. Because they had Supergirl as a as a fun, what's it called, unofficial story to the Superman story comic book series. When Superman was had a dream that his beloved girlfriend Lois Lane became Superwoman or Supergirl, and this was actually meant to promote women's rights. This was during the 1940s, which, of course, was so unheard of at that time because women obviously didn't have nearly as many rights as men did even back then. So it promoted that even during those times. So to the creators of DC Comics and Marvel, I would definitely like to send a tribute by saying thank you for opening up the minds of the masses because you were freedom fighters in your own rights. So to them, I would like to say thank you, even though they are deceased at the moment as we speak. But their spirit lives on through their creativity. And this is why I think those are the best comic book companies. But to make a long story short, you can learn a lot from comic books, from social issues, and it even pushed religious boundaries, and it was thought-provoking even in that aspect. So these are my 2 cents for this video, and it was longer than expected, but nonetheless, I hope you learned something. Take care.